Welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental issues that green up our world. Trees are not only beautiful, but crucial to life on Earth. To talk with us about their many benefits, we have Michael Kost, Curator of Native Plants at the University of Michigan's Matthaei Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum. Mike, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, thank you.
Well, we're really lucky to have you at the University of Michigan because I know you used to be the lead ecologist at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and you've published numerous publications, and this book I asked you to bring in, a field guide to the natural communities of Michigan that you wrote, which is just a beautiful book. I know that you know many things about ecology, so asking you to narrow your focus today to trees, I know it's going to be challenging. And also, you and I agreed ahead of time that we're going to use one species to just sort of be a, illustrative of the different benefits that trees have. You and I both love oaks, and so we're going to talk today mostly about oaks. Of course, all trees have many benefits, but oaks are America's national tree. We've got hundreds of oak species in North America. How many in Michigan are native?
I believe 11 species are native. One of those is a shrub, believe it or not.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's a small tree or shrub. It's kind of a bushy oak.
Chinkapin, whatever?
It's dwarf chinkapin oak.
Okay.
Chinkapin oak is a big tree, but this is it's called dwarf chinkapin oak, Quercus prinoides. All the oaks are in the genus Quercus.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've read that about a fifth of oak species globally are in danger of extinction, and some of our oaks here in Michigan are not doing real great either. So let's talk about the benefits of oaks. First of all, let's talk about to wildlife, for instance.
So the acorns are very important to maintaining wildlife. The one thing that surprises a lot of people is the oaks, they have more caterpillars that feed and insects that feed on them than other species. So they're our chief species to feed the birds, and that the key thing is that the warblers, I don't know if you've ever gone bird watching and watched the warblers, they come through late April, especially in mid-May, a crop comes through. And that migration is timed perfectly with the oaks flowering. And why? Because the insects are all around those oak flowers, and the insects are being eaten by the birds. So it's supporting the migration of the warblers as they move from Central and South America, Central America up to the Caribbean, up through North America.
You don't think of an oak as flowering. I mean,
right. They're not the type of showy flowers that we're used to. The flowers are very small. They're in bundles along a thin stem. Yeah.
I have read that oaks can have as many as 1,000 different insect species on them. And I think it's interesting that I used to think of insects as a bad thing for a plant. But when you think about the fact, I've been realizing lately that it's actually a lot of insects can coexist on a plant. They just have a little nibble and it's fine with the tree, right?
Absolutely.
So, and the fact that over half of them can be butterflies and moths, I mean, we all love seeing those, and I guess their larvae, like you say, are really important for birds.
They are. They're really important for birds. So what's really surprising is maples are another common tree, and we have many native maples in Michigan, as well as some maples that are not native, like Norway maple or Japanese maple. Very beautiful trees, but they don't support the diversity of insects nearly so. So it turns out that, and it makes sense because if you think over long periods of time, the ecosystem, the animals, the insects evolved with these species, right, that were here. But when we bring over new ones, they often don't bring their insect fauna with them. So it's a new species, and the insects don't flock to them. So consequently, they don't provide nearly the bird, the food for other wildlife that the native species do. The one oak that I think is really important to talk about is white oak. White oak historically was one of the most common trees in northeastern North America, and it's still very common in our forests today. But it is seldom occurs in the understory of the forest as a young tree. It will occur as a seedling, but those seedlings typically don't make it into the subcanopy level where they can assume eventually into a big tree in the canopy. And one of the problems is they don't reproduce very well under their own shade. In shade, they just don't, they're not able to continue growing past that early seedling stage with in shade, and so they shade out themselves. In our forest, we did a study where we looked at 105 different oak forests, and what we learned was that many of the oak forests are still dominated by oak trees. That's still the case, but the understories for most of the sites, except for the really sandy, dry sites, they're dominated by red maple. And that was a big surprise, because when we looked at these same sites historically, we went back to the notes that were taken in the early 1800s by the General Land Office survey. Red maple didn't occur in these sites. They often had white pine, but they didn't have red maple. Today, the understory is red maple. So what does that tell us? That tells us that in the future, the overstory is likely to be red maple. And the maples they have about half as many insects that use them. So these migrating warblers that are coming through to feed on all the insects that are associated with the flowering of these oaks, that spells a problem. And then you have bear and turkey and deer and squirrels and chipmunks and a whole host of wildlife, blue jays, that are eating the acorns. Yeah.
I have also read that even seed-eating birds, that 97% of them have to feed their young insects.
Yeah, they're high in protein. And that's the case.
So it's probably more than just warblers, right? That need these.
Those high protein sources are really important to the birds during the breeding season. Not so much during the fall. So as they migrate through the fall, they're eating the berries that are on the trees. And you think about all the shrubs, like the dogwoods, and Michigan holly, and the roses. They're producing these fruit.
Serviceberry.
Serviceberry, yeah, they're all late summer, early fall. They're producing these berries that are then feeding the birds during the fall migration. So yeah, fall migration, they'll glean a Michigan holly or a dogwood. They'll just glean all the berries right off them in the fall.
So it's good to have a diversity of species. I mean, we're talking up oaks, but in order to feed wildlife through the season, we need a diversity of species.
Right.
How about for shelter reasons? We, often cut down old trees, and they provide shelter, right? I've heard.
Yeah. So the natural cycle wouldn't be obviously to cut them. I mean, if the tree could live 300, oaks can live 300 plus years.
And people don't plant oaks too much these days.
No.
Why is that?
Well, they're often not available in the trade. There's a grower here in Michigan called Wild Type. Bill Schneider owns the company. They're in Mason, Michigan, just south of Lansing. There's another grower that will grow called Hidden Lake Savannah, Chad Hewson, over in Kalamazoo. They grow oaks, but many other places don't grow the diversity of oaks. Pin oak they'll often grow, but the oaks we'd really like to see people plant are white oak especially, and chinkapin oak and red oak and black oak. Those are swamp white oak. Those are oaks that are becoming less represented in the landscape today. So I think people don't plant them because, one, they're not available. Two is they're slow growing, and landscape architects often don't spec them in a plan. They don't often put them in a plan because they're slow growing, and they're concerned that it might not make it. So they'll plant trees that are more like so a lot of floodplain trees end up being planted, trees that can handle a little bit of abuse. The oaks are a little more temperamental.
Well, I've had good luck planting oaks. I think I might have ordered them through Arbor Day. I have done a lot of that. Or maybe I got them at the county.
Right.
In my day, I've planted a lot of trees, and the oaks, I've planted a lot of white oaks, scarlet oak, pin oak, but they did grow fast. I mean, I'm not arguing that oaks are comparatively slow growing, but I just want to encourage the audience that, in fact, that scarlet oak just grew huge in the few years that I lived at that house, and it was beautiful. So I would say, take a chance on oaks because they're not that hard to grow.
I've seen people grow oaks with a little bit of fertilizer, and they grow rapidly.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a matter of what kind of care you give it. Another thing that makes it really easy to do is you can grow oaks from acorns with great success. You simply.
That's free.
And what's fun about that is you can pick the tree you want,
Yeah.
Like you can pick some beautiful old white oak, that's not getting a chance to reproduce, and just collect its acorns. White oak acorns, white oak and bur oak, they're both, and swamp white oak are all in the white oak group. Those acorns germinate in the fall. So they'll germinate right off the bat. But
so you can go on a walk and collect it and then come home
and just put it in the ground, yeah.
Hmm.
One thing you can do if you wanted to be a little more serious is you just collect a bunch of acorns and you float them in a bucket. You just put them in a bucket of water. The ones that float are probably those you toss out and let wildlife have those. They're full of weevils. So oak acorns feed all kinds of things, including insects. But the ones that sink are solid, and those are the ones you want to plant. And I've done this, my wife and I have done this. You can take a shovel and you just a little, I don't mean dig a hole, you just put your shovel in the ground to break the sod and drop an acorn in there and step on it. Yeah, and then poop, and you can, and they'll come up and they'll germinate in the fall. But you notice that like during those first couple mowing sessions, they're up and you have to watch them. You know, when you're mowing your lawn and you put them in there. So. But and they'll come back after, sometimes they'll sprout back after one mowing.
Which reminds me, protection, well, number one from the lawnmower, but also from mice and rabbits and deer. You know,
so if you have enough acorns, you can feed both the wildlife and have an oak tree. But yeah, so if you've got one that's coming up and it's in the right spot and you did this and that's the one you want, then it would be great to cage it, just like you would with a young tree. So especially if there's deer in your yard, squirrels they love digging up those recently sprouted oaks. The acorn is still there. You can dig it up. You'll see the acorn is still intact. It just has a root coming out of it and a stem coming up. But so they'll dig them up at that point too sometimes. They're also curious, you know. So I think that happens.
It reminds me of the botanical gardens. When you drive in, there's so many of these cages that are protecting the...
That's for deer. So both from deer buck rubs and browsing. So yeah, and that's the way we can get a tree large enough so that we can take the cage eventually off. So we just need to protect it for that first, decade or so, or 5-10 years.
The cages remind me of the problems I've seen in parks where, and I'm sure it happens in yards a lot too, where weed whips will damage the bark. So a cage could help that
Absolutely.
too.
Yeah, it really makes it easy.
What's the danger with weed whipping?
The danger with weed whipping is cutting into the bark. So a lot of people don't realize that the only part that's really living on that stem of the tree, on the trunk, is a thin layer between the inside of the bark and the heartwood, the outside of the heartwood. It's called the cambium layer. And so the roots are taking water, and it's the xylem tissue, and bringing it up to the leaves, and the leaves, the photosynthesis, the photosynthesis products, there's glucose and sugars are coming down the plant. So there's a thin layer where these vascular tissues are coming up and carrying water and bringing photosynthesis to the rest of the plant. That is maybe about as thick as a nickel, or thinner.
It's really thin.
Yeah, and a young tree it would be like less than fingernail size. So when you cut that, you break that flow.
Yeah, I've heard it's like slicing your arteries and veins.
Yeah, that really. Essentially those are good. The vascular tissue is like the veins. Yeah.
So we need to make sure to protect the bark, and also giving a good soaking. Would you advise that during drought the first year?
So that is key. And that's one of the reasons why landscape architects often don't spec oaks, because they don't necessarily have someone to take care of the tree. If you take care, like if it's in your yard, the oaks will have great success just as much as any other tree. And maybe even more so, because you can water, you can fertilize. You don't have to fertilize. If you have rich soil, you don't have to fertilize. That will make the tree grow faster.
Yeah,
but you don't have to you don't have to do that. But water is key. Like after a couple of weeks or a month, you can start watering less and less. And next summer, you're going to have to continue watering a little bit, paying attention to the weather, working with Mother Nature. If it hasn't rained in a week, you're going to want to water. But that will ensure the success of that tree.
I've heard a good soaking versus a sprinkling.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you dig the hole, you want to have it big enough. So when you're planting a tree, you want to make sure that your hole is big enough and deep enough. And if you can, the topsoil that you took off, you want to save all the soil, and put as much of that along the sides and under the tree as possible. That topsoil, that first 6 inches of soil, in many places 4 or 5 inches, is the richest. That's the most nutrient for the plant. So if you can save that soil and pack it back in there, that works great, just having a big enough hole. So yeah, a good soaking, and just you have to use common sense.
I really like to think about future generations when I
Yeah,
plant
me
a
too.
tree, because even if I don't know if I'm going to live in that house long enough to see the tree get big, I mean, who cares? There's going to be someone that's going to appreciate
Right,
that tree
right.
someday. And
Yeah.
if not a person, certainly the animals are going to appreciate it. So anytime we can plant a tree, I just think it's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, it is a gift to the future. I mean, I think about all these beautiful oaks that we see along the roads as we drive, and you know, you see them along the expressways, and you know, someone had the foresight to allow that oak to grow in that farm field or along that, you know, that farm lane. They allowed it to be there. And if we can just allow it to be there, and that's a thing we have to realize, that oak might look very old to us, and it might be 150 years old. But for an oak tree, it may have another 150, 200 to go. So, and think about how many generations in your family that, you know, 200 years is, right?
Yep.
They say generations, 20 years, so that's 20 more generations.
Yep.
Or 10 more, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, so we can encourage more people to plant more oaks, because they're a wonderful species.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been fun.
For an online archive of all our Green Room shows, go to ewachta.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.